Sorry about the delay. My fault. 100% responsibility. False start, offsides, and broke the thing. But now it's fixed, so we're here. It's the Future of Freedom. I'm your host, Scott Horton. This is our guest, Jacob Hornberger, the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. How are you doing this evening?
Doing great. Good to be back with you for another round, Scott.
Yeah. This is our second show, and I really liked the first one. I hope you guys all liked it, and we'll like this new one too. Okay, so before I start interviewing you about things, I got to celebrate a little bit of good news, which is that the Senate has tried and failed to pass their resolution of disapproval of the Iran deal. The Democrats had the votes to stop them from getting their filibuster. First, the question was, will they be able to override the president's veto? Then the question became, will the Democrats be able to stop them from even passing the thing in the first place? And today they succeeded in that. And so, not that it's a done deal yet, because of course the Israel lobby is still going to do everything they can to try to come up with new sanctions and new ways to try to stop the deal. But at least for now, it looks like the Iran deal is a done deal, and Iran's nuclear program will go from a non-proliferation treaty, IAEA safeguarded civilian nuclear program, to a non-proliferation treaty, IAEA safeguarded civilian nuclear program with an additional protocol to their safeguards agreement, with less uranium than ever before, with fewer centrifuges than ever before, with one less enrichment plant, with a newly configured reactor that'll run on light water instead of heavy water, and so will not produce weapons-grade plutonium, and will have expanded inspections even to their mines and their centrifuge facilities, and the ridiculous, in my view, but whatever, for intents and purposes, I'm for it, most rigorous inspection regime on their civilian safeguarded nuclear program in the history of the world. It precludes any chance that they could break out and make a nuclear weapon within any time less than a year, giving America and Israel plenty of time to start a war when it comes to that, if it ever came to that. But it's been clear all along that this is a fake crisis, and the Iranians at worst only ever wanted a nuclear capability as half of a nuclear deterrent. If you bomb us, then we could begin to start to make nukes, as opposed to we have a nuke, so don't you bomb us. Different strategy. That's the way they played it, and now, at the very least, the can has been kicked decades down the road with the signing of the additional protocol and everything else. And so I think we're, all things else being equal, we're now some huge amount, I think, reduced tension here, reduced possibility of a real war between the United States and Iran, which is something that the Israelis have been pushing for more than a decade now. And looks like that's finally, the fake crisis has now finally been put at least somewhat to bed. And so, hallelujah. How do you like that? What do you think of that? You might completely disagree with me like that. I'm against the UN and the IAEA and all this crap in the first place, so I guess I'm kind of a hypocrite. But it's better than a hot war, which is what the war party wants.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we live in this world where the U.S. government is the world's policeman, and serving as the world's policeman and the world's bomber and the world's prosecutor and everything. It has to be engaged in this type of thing. I mean, I yearn for the day where the U.S. government lacks the power to police the world, to intervene in the affairs of other nations, where we don't have this constant series of crises, chaos, where there's got to be, everybody gets all hyped up, and then you got to negotiate a treaty and put sanctions on people and starve them to death and so forth. I mean, this is just really no way to live, Scott. And so that's why, we keep saying at the Future of Freedom Foundation that in order to get rid of these crises, you got to get rid of the apparatus that's contributing or even causing these crises, and that's the welfare warfare state.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw it yet, but you'll really enjoy it. It was an interview of Ron Paul on the Fox Business Channel today, and he was really just great. And the guy kept asking him exactly from the perfect conventional wisdom, just as you'd expect, that, well, yeah, but there's a problem, so we have to solve it, right? And the anchor even unashamedly used the phrase world policeman. Yeah, but if we're not the world's policeman, as though, because usually that's a pejorative, right? That's right-wing slang for intervening in the world where we shouldn't be, right? But here it's being used as, yeah, but geez, what if we stop? And Ron Paul just knocks it out of the park. And just, yeah, but look at how this is all because of everything that we have done there up to now. Iraq war under Bush, intervening in Syria under Barack Obama. That's what has led us to this current crisis. And so if you say we have refugees, yeah, and somebody should help them, and maybe we can help them or whatever. But if we don't get to the root cause of who turned the Middle East upside down, then we're not getting anywhere here. And I think the guy kind of couldn't help but learn what he was being taught. Nobody else talks like this around there. I mean, Judge Napolitano kind of tries pretty much, but nobody's as hard-hitting as Ron Paul like that. And it was just great. And then even when they hit him with the protest over the gay marriage thing, he said, oh, the libertarian answer is stop regulating these things, and then it's not a question. You take it away from being a political football that people have to fight about, which was perfect. But anyway, that's a tangent. I just like Ron Paul, and I like saying how much I do. But anyway,
I think you make a really good
just point. Like you're saying. Who got us into this mess? Who got them into this mess? Or a government that cares so much about these people now? Aren't we going to ask what role they have in turning these people's world upside down over there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because here you have this mass exodus of people who are really trying to save their lives. These are not people who are just trying to better their lives, which is a trait that's inherent to a lot of the immigrants, the illegal aliens. They just want to better their lot in life. These are people who are facing death, and it's either try to risk your life to get to safety and hope that a country accepts you, or die. And there's a lot of people saying, well, look, too bad, we don't want you to corrupt our country, so you just have to stay where you are and die. That's just the way life is sometimes. And the U.S. is part of that. I mean, you have that same standard answer, the answer that Franklin Roosevelt gave when he was president, and Hitler offered to let German Jews leave Germany in the 1930s. Imagine, he was willing to let all the Jews go, and Roosevelt says, "Oh, no, we have immigration controls and we have a certain quota, and that would exceed our quota." Well, that's what they're saying here. The U.S. officials, Barack Obama, who's a liberal, purports to love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged, that they only have a quota like of 1,500 Syrians. Well, it's the U.S. government that has instigated this civil war in Syria as part of a regime change operation. They did it in Libya. They did it in Iraq. They did it in Afghanistan. They're doing it all over the Middle East, except in the countries where they have their favorite dictators, like in Egypt. And so, at the very minimum, if you're not going to help save these people's lives, and you're going to say, go back to your countries and die, the very minimum you would think that the government should stop the bombing. Is that too much to ask? To stop the chaos and the crises and the bombing and the shooting and the assassinations? I mean, if anybody bears responsibility for getting out of the Middle East at this point, after all of what they have wreaked here, death and destruction, it's the U.S. government. So if you're not going to help these people, okay, that's one thing. But at the very minimum, then stop causing what's causing them to escape and try to save their lives. Stop the bombing. Stop the interventions.
Well, and of course, the war party doesn't even have a plausible explanation for what they're supposed to be doing there. I mean, if the Islamic State is a place and not just a group now, which I think really is apt, then on their eastern front, we're backing the Shiites and the Iranians against them. But on their western front, we're backing their, not necessarily allies, but their exact clones that are still, at least their de facto allies, the Sunni jihadists, against Assad, who is basically the exact clone of the Iraqi government, right? An Iranian-backed Shiite leader, only he's leading a secular coalition. And even now, more than a year after the declaration of the caliphate has come as a consequence of American intervention in the war in Syria, leading to this huge explosion of of the jihadist group into a real government, basically, as after what they've become. They're still, you turn on the news, they're still talking about Assad must go, and not just the neocon war party, but even Barack Obama. And I'm not saying America should be backing him. Obviously, no libertarian is saying America should be backing Assad, but we're actually still helping the rebels against him when, as you're talking about the consequence of all of these refugees, they're basically fleeing the jihadists that we've been putting in power. And now just imagine, Jacob, you know, they say the worst part of the Iraq war, never mind the invasion, weapons of mass destruction and all of that, but the worst thing that they did was they abolished the state, basically. They fired every Ba'athist and they abolished the army, and that's what led to the chaos. Well, look at what they're doing in Syria right now. They're trying to de-Ba'athify the government and abolish the army. At which point, all the Druze, all the Alawites, all the Shiites, all the Christians, and most of the Sunnis even, who still back the army and the state there, will be at the mercy of the suicide bombers and the head choppers. So, yes, we're bombing the Islamic State, but we and the Turks and the Saudis and the Israelis are still helping al-Nusra and the so-called Free Syrian Army, who are basically de facto Islamic State shock troops. If they don't work directly for the Islamic State, they just take territory for them and move on. So what the hell is that? I mean, the whole thing, they don't even have an argument to sell you. In fact, the Kagans put out a thing saying we got to send 25,000 troops to Iraq immediately, and in the introduction they say it is impossible. Oh, and that's the neocon royal family: Robert Kagan, Fred Kagan, Kimberly Kagan, from all the neocon think tanks. Bill Kristol's best buddy, and they said it's impossible to articulate a clear path to the desired end state. In other words, we have no plan. We don't even have a lie to sell you about how this is supposed to work. Now give us 25,000 troops so we can make it that much worse. It's incredible.
Well, it's really just standard fare. I mean, if you go back to one of their earliest regime change operations in Guatemala, 1953, they ousted the democratically elected president of the country. And the result was a civil war that lasted for 30 years, killed over 1 million people, and that was just part and parcel of their regime change operation. So when they go into the Middle East and they say, well, we're going to oust Saddam Hussein, who ironically was Iran's enemy, so by ousting him and installing the Shiite regime, we're really installing the ally of Iran. I mean, that's why Iranian officials can fly into Baghdad and spend the night and walk the streets and feel at home, while the U.S. president, when he goes into Iraq's got to do in broad daylight, top secret, definitely not spend the night there because he doesn't feel safe. And you've got this civil war. I mean, let's face it, the ISIS battle is really just a civil war. It's expanded beyond Iraq, but I mean, much of ISIS is the former Saddam Hussein regime. And why would this surprise anybody, that people would be angry that a foreign imperialist power has invaded a country with the intent of ousting them from power and all their largesse that comes from being in power, and what, they were going to just accept it mildly and passively? I mean, sure, that might work in some countries like Panama or Grenada where the U.S. is intervening for, but it doesn't work that way in the Middle East. You got some people that are very proud there that said, to heck with this regime change operation. And let me tell you that this regime in Iraq, it's not this kind of like nice, beautiful, innocent regime. This is a brutal, corrupt regime that engages in the same type of stuff that Saddam Hussein was doing. Torture, indefinite detention, arbitrary arrest, arbitrary searches and seizures, death, destruction, and it's really nothing that the U.S. ought to be in there trying to protect and sacrifice for. It's just not worth getting involved anymore. The U.S. has done enough damage here, and by trying to fix what they've done, they're only making it worse. I mean, it's your classic case of you got a fire, and so what the U.S. is saying is, let's go pour some gasoline on it in the hopes that we can put out the fire. And of course, we all know what the result is.
Yep. And the only sides that we have to pick from are the Shiite death squads, or the jihadists, or the military dictators, or Who's the most democratic group in any of these countries that's come to power at all? In Egypt, the people overthrew the American sock puppet dictator, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood that came to power, which is sort of like Al Qaeda, only they're all really old and rich and conservative and not radicals. So they're Islamists, but they're easier to get along with, basically. And that's the very best case scenario, and that was so horrible to the American empire, they immediately, with the Saudis, worked to get the military to overthrow and cancel the results of the free elections and put the Muslim Brotherhood all in prison or the grave since then. And so that's it. Every other actor over there is either a suicide bomber or is torturing his victims to death with power drills, or is dropping barrel bombs on civilians out of helicopters. And so, yeah, there's no better time to quit, because there's not a single faction that you could point to and say, yeah, these are our guys.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams really had it right. I really wish Americans would go and read that speech. It is such a remarkable speech. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy, where Adams is setting forth the foreign policy of the U.S. government. That this is the country that the Constitution brought into existence, the government. That we know there's bad things that happen in the world. There's dictators, there's crises, there's violence, there's chaos, there's famine, starvation. There's like these refugees. But John Quincy Adams, in this speech to Congress on the 4th of July in 1821, says, look, we know those bad things happen around the world, but the U.S. government is not going abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. Because he says if we do that, we're ultimately going to change as a country. That the government, the U.S. government, if we were to do that, would become a dictatress of the world, he says. And it would change the character of the American people. And yet that's exactly what has happened now with the national security state and this philosophy of foreign interventionism. Here you have, it's much more than a policeman. It's a dictator. It's saying you do things our way or it's the highway, which means bombs and missiles, invasions, occupations, sanctions, and so forth. And so you've changed the nature of the U.S. government into a dictatress, but you've also changed the character of America. You've got people that are over there beating up Arab-looking people here in the United States who are Muslim Americans because they're saying they look like terrorists. A lot of times they're like Indians from the country India, and they start beating those up too. And you've got
the Sikhs. They got those big turbans, so it's easy to confuse them.
And they got beards, so they must be terrorists. Yeah. I mean, it's ugly. It's really ugly, the kind of society in which we're turning. And it's all because when you have a society whose government is constantly killing people, that's inevitably going to seep through the subconscious and the conscious of the citizenry. That's, in my opinion, that's why you've got all this violence among the police, the militarization and all this, because all of the violence that the U.S. government is engaged in overseas ultimately cannot help but seep into the society at large.
Yeah. Well, in your article, and a good time to get right to it here, America's police state is rooted in 4 federal wars. We already really covered immigration last time. But and you do this often. You say, hey, look, they have the power now to put Americans in prison without trial, that kind of thing. But, I think most people don't know that, because the truth is they've invoked these kind of powers to themselves in memos. And, in fact, even in law now, in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 and its successor act since then, they've, codified these things in law. But they've really only done this to Padilla, was the only American citizen that they've done it to yet. And I guess they almost did it to the Underpants bomber. And Al-Mari, he was not a citizen, but he was a U.S. person arrested in Peoria, of all places, right? Like the cliche Middletown, USA kind of place. But the thing is that actually, under the current law, Jacob, as you claim here correctly, any of our sisters or brothers or family members of any description in this country, or including ourselves, could be abducted by the military legally, they wouldn't be breaking the law to do it. They'd be following the law to take us away and claim that we're enemy combatants. We're the stab in the back. We're undermining the war effort with all our anti-war talk and helping the enemies win, and take us away based on the most mildest version of association that you could come up with, right? Like who all is in your cell phone and who do they know? These are the kinds of things that could get us thrown in military detention. And it just seems crazy because they're not doing it, right? They're not going door to door seizing guns and rounding people up, but they seem to be accumulating the power to do that, at all times. I don't know when the shoe's supposed to drop or whatever, but that's the thing I think where people don't realize it's an emergency because they've got this sort of Damocles hanging over our head for so long we start ignoring it. We forget about that it's there.
That is really an excellent point, and it does show the root of the problem is that if they're not doing mass roundups like they were doing in World War II when they rounded up American citizens of Japanese descent, and they've only done it to one person, one American citizen, the mindset is, what are we worried about? You guys, I mean, and the average person, middle-class person that's, the lawyer, the banker, he's safe. They would never go after him. The compliant, good citizen, the one that stands up at the sports events and praises the troops for defending our freedoms, they're not the ones at risk here. That of course they're not doing it now. But the risk is in a real crisis. Let's say that war accidentally breaks out between Russia and the United States and Ukraine, and all of a sudden we're looking at a real emergency here. Or that war breaks out between North Korea and China and the United States just through some stupid act that is taking place over there, like broadcasting songs or something across the border. Well, all of a sudden, things are going to change immediately because now these latent powers, these powers that now exist, now rise to the surface. So now the roundups can begin of anybody who criticizes the government. There was just a professor at West Point just a couple of weeks ago that called for drastic action against people that were questioning the, quote, war effort. I mean, I don't know if those were his exact words, but
lawyers. Yeah, it was how dare the Jonathan Turleys of the world get up there and say, I'm a law professor and I'm telling you what the Bill of Rights means. How dare you is who he's really addressing, is people like that, cutting right to the core of the problem. Never mind, Scott Horton show. Let's go after anybody who would dare sit at their fancy university and pronounce that the government is breaking the law in the case of the war on terror. So, yeah, he did get fired, or he had to resign over that, but, still, I bet you there are a lot that agreed with him.
Oh, there's no question about it. And let me tell you something. If the president, whoever the new president is, whether it's Hillary or Donald Trump or Jeb Bush or whatever, if the president orders them to start rounding people up in a real emergency, I can guarantee you the troops are going to obey orders. That's what troops do. They obey orders. And 99% of the people in that contingent who are responsible for the roundups and the placement in the concentration camps, they will obey orders and do it. And the 1% that says we're not going to do it, they'll be simply shunted aside and replaced. So that's why we keep talking to people now, that now's the time to change the system back to what it was supposed to be, where the military doesn't have this control over the citizenry. I mean, the fact that it happened to one American, Jose Padilla, as you mentioned, is extremely significant, because this is one of the reasons we were fighting so hard in that particular case, is that the federal courts upheld what they did to Padilla. What they do to him? They took him into military custody. They put him in a military dungeon. They tortured him with sensory deprivation with the intent of leaving him a mental vegetable, which, from what I understand, he partly is. And they took the position that they could keep him there for the rest of his life. Now, and the courts upheld that. That means that that's precedent. That means that if they can do it to him, they can do it to everyone. That power now exists, and that's why it's important that every American understand that. It's a new game now, post 9/11, of who's in charge. And there's no question at all but that the military and also the CIA are now in the position of sovereign, supreme, and the citizen is in the position of serf. That's what we need to make people aware of, and then figure out a way to restore things to the way they were supposed to be in this country when the country was established.
Well, and the thing of it is, too, it's only as recently as a few years ago that the excuse for all this was an absolute joke. I mean, at the time of September 11th, Al Qaeda was a couple of few hundred guys, and the CIA with laser pointers and the Air Force went and killed most of them before the real war in Afghanistan, against the Taliban and everything ever even started. I mean, right from the very beginning, they blasted them. There were only a few dozen that got away. And it took Bush invading Iraq and turning the table over, and then Obama setting all the scraps on fire after that with his wars in Libya and Syria, to turn it into the situation where now they can, with a straight face, point at, I don't know, 10 or 50,000 jihadists in the world, maybe, across North Africa and across the Levant now and into Mesopotamia. And not that they're all, hell-bent on coming west, but some of them are, and it's in their interest to try to bait us into reinvading, like they wanted in the first place back a dozen years ago. So now we're in a position where, damn, Jacob, I really wish everybody listened to us back when we warned them, because now we're already in the future where they didn't listen to us, and now the prospect of being able to roll this stuff back when they can point at the vast numbers of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, foot soldiers around that part of the world, makes it that much more difficult.
Well, not really. I don't think so, because, look, it's very easy just to pull your troops back and come back home. Those people, most of them, 99% of them, they have no interest in coming to the United States and conquering America and taking over the federal government, running the IRS. Their bailiwick is over there. That's what their objective is, and doesn't make a whit's bit of difference whether ISIS controls Iraq or Al Qaeda controls Iraq. I mean, look, the U.S. government's enemy is in control in North Korea. It was in control in Vietnam for many years. Once the U.S. got out of Vietnam, not one single Vietnamese, from what I know, came over here to the United States to commit terrorist acts or did revenge. And I mean, there was a lot of cause for revenge. Most people just want to get rid of this foreign invader, this occupier. And once the U.S. comes home, I think you would see a totally different scenario as far as the American people are concerned. But the national security state can't handle that. They need these crises. I mean, when the Cold War ended and they lost the Soviet Union as their official enemy, they immediately started provoking people in the Middle East. So you had the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center back in '93. You had the terrorist attacks on the USS Cole and the embassies in East Africa, and then 9/11. And so it provides this largesse, this military largesse for all the military defense contractors, the subcontractors, the hundreds of thousands of people that are dependent on this thing. It's a racket. It's like Smedley Butler says, it's a deadly racket here. And so, yeah, regardless of the damage they've caused, bring all the troops home, discharge them into the private sector, close all the foreign military bases, and you're going to see all of a sudden America getting on the road to what we really want, and that's a peaceful, prosperous, and harmonious society.
All right, now here's the thing. The war on drugs, that's a big part of your article here, too. Again, it's at fff.org. America's police state is rooted in 4 federal wars, and that is, of course, the IRS war on productivity, immigration, terror, and drugs. But so I'd like for you to please give your best case against the war on drugs, but do it like you're trying to convince the most concerned mom that you can, because you're talking about a peaceful and prosperous and harmonious society. But man, haven't you ever known anybody who had a heroin or a cocaine problem? That could be really destructive to them and their friends and their families and things like that. And what's harmonious about that? So, you just want to send the wrong message to the children that these things are okay to do, Jacob. And I'm not saying that just to be sarcastic, but really that is the devil's advocate position. Moms concerned as hell that what you're saying, no drug war, means freely available, horrible and horribly addictive and destructive drugs for their children. So address that.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's devil's advocate, but it's real. I've heard it. I mean, I've got family members that have told me that, and of course the drug problem is a big problem. I mean, nobody discounts that. But the fact is that everyone who wants drugs is getting it, including young people. I mean, you can go into any high school in the country, and everybody's knows who the contact is, where he can get the drugs. So the drug war has not done anything to diminish that. And I would argue that it's actually accentuated the problem. Here's why. That if in a regime of legalized drugs, which is what America had for 140 years or so, including the children, where it was legal for children too, that where you have that regime, the drug gangs and the drug lords can't operate because they can't compete in a legitimate market. They can't compete against the pharmacists or the drug distributors or the drugs manufacturers. They can only compete when in a black market where it's illegal. So you've got these unsavory people that are providing these drugs. They don't care what happens to kids. They just soon get kids on cocaine, marijuana, heroin, whatever. They couldn't give a hoot. In a legalized market, all that changes because now the only suppliers are pharmacists, reputable companies. Now, who's going to be more responsible and more discriminating when a kid walks in there and says, I'd like to buy some cocaine? I mean, the local pharmacist is not about to risk his reputation and the anger of parents and family by doing that. You just have a much better chance of a nice outcome with the legalized market. In addition to that, Scott, you've got a lot of drug addiction. There's no question, but you want to encourage people to seek rehabilitation, to seek therapy for that. People can't do that under this regime. If they go into a rehab center, there's always a chance that a narc's going to be in there, or that somebody's going to get angry or get upset at somebody and turn them in, report that they're on drugs. I just read an article where the DEA has been accompanying officials of the Texas Medical Board or something into doctors' offices saying that they need to review patients' records because they want to see who's taking drugs and which doctors are prescribing drugs. It's all illegal. They didn't have a warrant. Now, once people learn that, what are the chances that somebody's going to go to a doctor and seek professional help when he knows the DEA is going to go over there and look at this paper record? So when you look at that and you look at the disaster this war has done with gang wars, killings, robberies, muggings, asset forfeiture, police corruption, judicial corruption, I don't see that there's any arguments left now. I mean, the argumentation to me is over. The only argument they have left now is that this provides jobs for judges and clerks and prosecutors and drug gangs and drug dealers. That's all they have left.
Stimulus.
Yeah, stimulus. They got nothing left.
Yeah, just welfare for judges who make what, $250,000 a year, something like that, usually. Or
yeah,
I guess it depends on what level.
And you've got the state judges too, and yeah, if you get rid of this drug war, there's going to be a lot of federal judges that are twiddling their thumbs because their dockets are filled with ridiculous cases.
Another big point I think I saw Ron Paul make one time to I guess some newspaper editors saying, what about AIDS? Man, I mean, there are places, still many places in America where it's illegal to give clean needles to addicts. But, you know, hey, man, they're addicts. Let's take that as a given. Today, this guy's an addict. Can we give him clean needles? No, you could get in trouble for giving him clean needles. And then some other places they've had, like underground. In fact, in Austin, Texas, I know they used to have an underground needle exchange for heroin addicts to try to keep the AIDS down. And all because of the prohibition. And just think about, we're talking about AIDS, man. All capital letters, AIDS. The worst thing that could happen to somebody. And so, you often hear the argument, well, legalize a little bit of medical pot, this or that. I like that approach of starting with heroin first. Never mind pot. Of course, legalize pot. Let's legalize heroin. Let's legalize heroin immediately. And if you're against that, then you've got a real problem. How dare you try to inflict AIDS on this society and all the criminality and all the other consequences, as you mentioned, where, yeah, the argument should be way passed over by now. And yet what we usually get is, okay, well, I'll legalize a little bit of medical pot, but no, not heroin, right? Like Bob Barr running as a Libertarian candidate. Oh, no, not heroin. It's like, man, if the Libertarian candidate doesn't want to legalize heroin, then, he's just setting us back, really. I mean, it ought to just go without saying at this point that of course legalize heroin, or else justify yourself. You know, not the burden isn't on us anymore.
Yeah, and there's a moral argument that I have a right to ingest whatever I want to ingest without being punished by the state for it. I mean, that to me is the central argument. This is what freedom's all about. It's not the right to do what is responsible. It is the right to do what is irresponsible, as long as your conduct is peaceful and you're not infringing on other people's rights. And your point about AIDS is absolutely right on. And there's another twist to this, and that is that when they say people die of drug overdoses, usually it's not an overdose at all. That's what they call it. It's a corrupt mixture of drugs that has taken place in the black market. That doesn't happen in a legalized market. Companies are very, very careful not to corrupt their drugs. They don't want to get sued, go bankrupt in court with some large judgment. But these black market types, they don't worry about getting sued. They're not going to get sued. So in a legalized market, you're right. The people who are the addicts, people that we should care about, that they would be able to get clean needles for their addiction. They would be able to get pure drugs for their addiction. That's a good thing. I mean, it's not a good thing that they're addicted, but it's a good thing that they're not dying as a result of these corruptions and dirty needles and so forth. You know, if we legalize the market, it's a much more harmonious way to treat the problem and then help people get out of the problem.
Yeah. And plus, I mean, I guess it's just an anecdote or whatever, but I can speak from experience of addicts I've known who've gone to jail and got out and they were still addicted to cocaine or still addicted to heroin, and then later they decided to go ahead and get better and get off drugs, and so they did. And the government didn't help, you know, kicking in their door and terrorizing them with SWAT guns in their faces and hauling them off to jail, forcing them go to addiction courses and all these horrible things, putting them on probation and making them pay all these fines. None of that helped them at all. They all just, eventually the drug use was, even they couldn't ignore that it was doing them more harm than good, and they had to knock it off, and so they finally did. You know, just like you wouldn't expect adult to do when he makes a mistake. And you're like, yeah, eventually rectify it. You know, why do we need a war? Who invented a war to come in between a man and his addiction? It's crazy.
Yeah, well, the most successful drug rehab program in history is Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's entirely voluntary with no government help or government participation or interference at all.
Well, a lot of government mandating that people go to it, but still, yeah. I mean, mostly it is voluntary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really the only humane way to do things. And this war has been going on, what, for 40 years? And as I said in my article, this here is the root of the infringements on freedom, the police state. Look at all the warrantless searches of automobiles, the pat-downs. Look at the racist consequences of this war, where cops essentially have been given a license to stop any black or Hispanic they want to in the name of the war on drugs and be glorified for it. And so everything about the drug war is negative. We were saying this 25 years ago, and people really didn't know because there wasn't that much experience with it. But Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate, was saying the same thing. He was saying it as far back as the early 90s, even before in the 80s. And yet people wouldn't listen to us. But I think they're starting to listen now, because my hunch is the drug war is going to be the first one of these programs to go. There's too many people that are now realizing the truth of this thing. You can just Google drug legalization. It's on the table, and this war is teetering.
Right. And you know what? I didn't mean to contribute to the mythology either by asking the concerned mom question. It just seems like, you know, that's the one that they always fling at us. But, you know, again, I'll just bring up Ron Paul again because he's the source of so many of these things I guess I've learned over the years. But I remember him talking about Plan Colombia, where Joe Biden's going and spraying poison on all the coca crops and all that kind of thing down in Peru and what have you, and how when it comes to Plan Colombia Day on Capitol Hill, there's no concerned moms against cocaine abuse group up there lobbying for this. It's Bell Helicopter up there saying, gimme, 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 gimme. Let's go spray poison on the people of Peru so we can cash our dividend checks. And that's it. They're the only ones lobbying. The only people who get outraged when you say legalize drugs are the police unions and the companies that make their bulletproof vests and all their, you know, fancy gear and their armored trucks.
It's part of the welfare warfare state. I mean, you've got the total militarization of the drug war in Latin America. And notice that here, the military is not permitted to participate in the drug war, at least not openly, because we say that's a bad thing. But then we send our military into Latin America and say, do your thing down there, even though we don't let you do it up here. And so you have the whole militarization of the drug war down in Latin America, along with all the violence, the corruption. I mean, they've essentially destroyed Latin America with their drug war. And fortunately, the Latin Americans are starting to figure it out, because a lot of them are moving in the direction of ending the war on drugs in their countries.
Yeah. All right, well, we've already stayed over time. I know we got a late start, but we're staying late too. I hope we're not messing up anybody's schedule to come after us or anything. But so first of all, let me say this is, everyone, I guess you can't see it very well in the light. This way. The Future of Freedom. This is Jacob Hornberger. Did this just come off backwards, sir? This is... You guys getting a mirror image of me? This is the Journal of the Future of Freedom Foundation. It comes out every month, fff.org/subscribe. And he is Jacob Hornberger. He is the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He writes in every issue of this, but you can also find James Bovard and a lot of other great writers in there as well. And so this has been the second episode of the Future of Freedom. I'm Scott Horton. I'm at scotthorton.org. And again, he's Jacob Hornberger. Thanks very much, Jacob. See you next Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time.
It was a pleasure. See you then. Thanks, Scott.